This is Joel Blackstock with the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast. Unfortunately, Alice was not able to be with us today, but we have our guest, Sandra del Castillo. And correct me if I'm saying that wrong or incorrectly. Is that right?
No, you did it. That's great. Del Castillo.
Perfect.
Nice. And I'm surprised and delighted.
So yeah, she has a podcast that I like, which is how I found her, which is the Blue Medicine Journal, which we're working on getting in more podcast libraries right now. It's just in a couple, but if you Google it, you'll find it. And she is a specialist in depth psychology and Mesoamerican mythology, as from an archetypal perspective. So I'm sure that this conversation is going to be really interesting. I'm so happy that you're here with us, and thank you so much for being here. So you got anything before we get started? You want to give an introduction of yourself, or have any questions about where this should go?
Thank you, Joel. First of all, thanks for finding me and tuning into my podcast, Blue Medicine Journal, a Jungian podcast. My background is from Pacifica Graduate Institute. I got my master's and PhD there. And I did my dissertation on the Mexican Day of the Dead from a Jungian perspective. So in that process, I was able to delve really deeply into the Mesoamerican, which became a passion and began just leading me through the entire process. So, and like I said, or like you said, it's through a Jungian lens. So it's not that I have this vast amount of knowledge and expertise in what is the Mesoamerican, but rather what is the Mesoamerican through a Jungian lens. And that to me is what makes it key, and allows me to show its relevance today as we, find ourselves in this Kairos moment, this between worlds moment, or, sixth grade extinction.
The liminal space, kind of like the Day of the Dead, this overlapping of two worlds. But so when you say, archetypal, I'm hearing you mean that, you're looking more at the kind of, projective and, timeless elements of the psyche in the mythology, but you're saying you're not quite like an anthropologist or an archaeologist or a historian on, the whole history of Mesoamerican stuff. So when you're coming at that, to look at it, I mean, do you use mainly kind of Aztec, or the similarities between the Aztec and the Maya, like the heroic twins, or do you go back to the Olmecs and the Toltecs? How far? What is your area of interest outside of the Day of the Dead?
I do tend to focus on the Mayan and the Aztec because they're the most accessible. Although I am very interested in the Olmec as well, and the Toltec, of course, that's where we find the roots of Quetzalcoatl, right? Who was both a mythic figure, one of the creator gods, and also the historic god man. So there's two different figures of Quetzalcoatl, but coming from the Toltec culture. I also have interest in the Purépecha, which is my ancestral heritage. So that's from the state of Michoacán on my father's side. My father was 100% Purépecha. So when I had the privilege of living in Michoacán for 6 years, I was able to delve into the myth and the ritual and the indigenous medicine and indigenous ritual in that area, and be able to participate in ceremonies at the ritual sites. And to me, it was one of the most learning experiences I've ever had. And of course, that region is renowned for its Mexican Day of the Dead, which helped inspire my dissertation. Although death would have never been my first conscious choice, it certainly became the unconscious choice.
Pacific is a good place for that. So I guess my first question is, Legends of the Hidden Temple, is it historically accurate or not?
Well,
Nickelodeon show from the 90s.
I don't know. That's a good question.
It's not. It's a joke. It was a game show where they would have kids. They had a giant talking stone head called Olmec was like the announcer, and then the kids would have to like run and get a prize. I don't know. It was like on TV in like '94.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. I have no idea. I was living in Mexico at the time. Totally out of tune with anything.
You're hanging out with the real Olmec head, yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, when I was living in Veracruz, because I got to live in 4 different states in Mexico, which was just an amazing experience for over a period of 15 years. And one of the places I lived was in the state of Veracruz, in the capital, Jalapa. where one of the largest anthropological or archaeological museums, second to the one in Mexico City, is. And that's where the enormous Olmec heads are.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually get to perform a visual theater piece in that phenomenal museum. And it is an experience of the numinous when you're around the Olmec heads.
And the Olmec, that is an Olmec site, right? Is where that museum is. Whereas the one in Mexico City is in Tenochtitlan is the Aztec temple. But
Absolutely.
What's interesting to me about the archaeology there is like the Olmecs and the Toltecs, like the Aztecs knew about those empires, and they kind of, their kings would link their ancestry to those kings. Probably it probably was not real, but they would pretend, like we pretend, well, I'm and somehow affiliated with this ancestral line. But they had those artifacts around, so they were digging up those things for inspiration. I mean, you found where there's pieces of jade and things that have been repurposed. Not jade, what am I thinking of? It's the bluestone. uh I don't, you found places where they had dug things up from the Olmecs and then repurposed it and brought it into the other things. So, can you say anything about the difference in those cultures? I guess we don't know a ton outside of archaeological findings about Olmec mythology, whereas Aztec, the Spanish do write some of it down, even if it's not
Well,
totally
what we
there.
know is that the Olmec it was considered in Latin America or Mesoamerica like the first. And I think arising around 1200 BCE. And one of the things that Joseph Campbell says in his book, The Mythic Image, he talks about these ancient cultures that had a social and political order that was celestially based.
Yeah.
And it began, this is archetypal in nature, and it began, as he, in his findings, in around the 4th century BCE, and with the in Mesopotamia with the ziggurats. And for a certain class of priesthood that were priests and kings, astronomers, astrologers, that after careful observation of the planets, they were able to derive this celestially based social and political order. And religious, the entire calendar was based around what they found. Now, this model, which Campbell called the most culturally far-reaching in human history, and significant, you can see its archetypal nature in that it sprung up, afterwards in Crete, Egypt, India, China, Greece, throughout the world without the use of the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, there's where you see the archetypal nature. It always spirals back around, and it sprouts forth. And so this sprouted forth in 1200 BCE in Mesoamerica, and it just sort of spread. And so this is the kind of thing that I look for in whether it was with the Aztecs or the Mayas or the Toltecs. This kind of correlation, to me, I think, is the most profound, and I find the most relevant, because these were aligned with the cosmos. So we saw the world order, or in alignment with the cosmos that we've effectively been cut off from since the Cartesian. An important part of human evolution, to sort of distinguish us from the participation mystique, and find ourselves, as individuals, and yet at the same time we lost the world soul, right? The anima mundi. We lost connection with that. And so to me, my search back is to glean this archetypal wisdom that was lost through the conquest. And I consider the real gold. And at this, crucial moment in time, something that we need to learn from, something that we need to readapt. I think it was like in the 1990s, the former Czech president, Václav Havel, was giving a keynote speech to the students at Stanford. And he talked about this. He talked about the importance, of a world democracy formed from the celestially based, let's say, unity once again. That's the only way that we would ever have it. I think that, as humanity finds ourselves in this, you know, Kairos moment, what Jung called the Kairos moment, I think that, and let me explain a little bit about that in terms of the Kairos, a Greek word meaning opportune moment, right?
Mhm.
And back in the 1960s, Jung, I think, was probably in his 80s by that point, but he sensed this pervasive mood of destruction and renewal that was
Mhm.
haunting um, the humanity, Western mind anyway. And he, looking forward, he felt that it was an ideal time for what he called a metamorphosis of the gods. Now, that's a mythopoetic way of saying, for a changing of worldview,
Mhm.
right? Of the fundamental principles and symbols that define our era. And so as the world around us crashes and burns, so we can gather from these ancient archetypal wisdoms that have, ruled and formed order in ancient civilizations, and puts us once again attuned to the world soul, to the ensouled cosmos, which we've been
Mhm.
cut off from. We've been disenchanted. So I think that's part of my work, is a form of re-enchantment, of reclaiming in the now what we've lost. But so Jung called in the Red Book, he said, giving birth to the ancient in a new time is the task.
Mhm.
That's the salvation. And um, it's like giving birth to a new world. And that's in essence, I think, what depth psychologists are looking for now. I mean, your program, the podcast that you run, you're looking for that. You're talking about um, the to the detail of what does architecture look like,
Yeah.
and what is, to me, that's one of the things that I also grasp from Mesoamerica.
Well, I mean, I think depth psychology informs all aspects of human existence because, there's these, just like you're taking, what are you doing in depth psychology? You have a patient, they're, usually older by the time they make it into Jungian analysis, and you're starting to say, okay, well, here are the patterns in your life. You kind of have to be alive a little while before we see those patterns. And then they're like, well, what do I do with those? And you're like, well, I don't know. I'm not a cognitive therapist. You just notice them, and then you can't unnotice them. We can't undo what we just did. And then they're like, well, I tried this, I tried that, and it doesn't work, and I can't change them. Well, I'm angry. I'll just put it down. Oh, well, no, they're still there. And then somebody continues to work through these things until there's able to kind of be a breaking and restructuring. But people work the same way. We have these patterns in civilization that are bigger than one life or one city or one nation or one millennium, that go back, and which is you're talking about there at the beginning of most mythological, the fusion of the kind of religious and logical systems, is science and religion, which weren't seen as separate entities back then. It was just knowledge, was people projecting on the stars. They see these patterns. The patterns continue to happen. Well, why are they there? What is the explanation for that? And then we start to have this central myth. There's China, Aztecs, everyone has it. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I've heard a story that there was like a missionary that like went to the Aztecs and thought, oh, these primitive people don't know anything about, you know, uh, astronomy, but really they had a calendar that was so accurate it didn't even need a leap year. It was better than the uh, it was better than the European calendar, and so he told them, "Oh, well, you need to convert to Christianity because there's going to be an eclipse. I can predict it because my God told me." And they're like, "We know there's going to be an eclipse too, dude," and so they just killed him. I don't know.
No, I have no idea. I have no
Yeah.
idea that story, but it's a good one. I have no idea.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, the fact that any, I mean, what do we know about our neighbors to the south, really, other than what's been taught, in our history books, which is a general, let's say, emphasis on their shadow. We know really nothing about.
Well, it's such a through a glass darkly thing because the Spaniards are writing down what Aztecs believed in order to say that it's bad. So they're sort of embellishing the worst parts, but you can maybe see a grain of truth through it. Another one, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but have you read James Maffey's book, the Aztec Philosophy?
No, I haven't. I'm gonna
Aztec
read.
metaphysics. He's an archaeologist, so he's coming at it from. But he says basically that all of the The worldview, we are thinking of it from kind of a Eurocentric perspective as gods or whatever, like it's a Greek pantheon, but that wasn't really it. It was this interconnected energy that they sort of saw energy as being just this pervasive thing that was sort of at tension with itself. Sometimes you have the twins that are opposites that have to get along to create the world, and that everything is connected. When you look at the temple, there's like the snakes are all wrapped around whatever, but it's not really separate figures like the Parthenon. And so they really saw these things as just kind of being inevitable expressions of just kind of universal principles. And when the Spanish are like, go ahead and break your gods, smash these things, they're just kind of confused. And they're like, well, we can break these rocks if you want, but the gods are dead. Like the, the moon goddess has already been dismembered, like these things are just part of the way that the universe works. And there was this confusion, whereas the Spanish saw, a lot of the architecture as like idols in a way that, they couldn't understand. The Aztecs saw that more as um, just a representation of their worldview, you know, which is harder to break.
Well, I mean, because it's archetypal in nature,
Mhm,
that's the point. I mean, one of the things that, for instance, James Hillman said is that he wasn't advocating for, the Greek religion to be reborn, but rather a psychological faith in what we recognize as these gods, the ancient gods,
mhm,
whether they're Greek or Aztec or Mayan or Olmec, Toltec, as archetypal principles, qualities and
mhm,
styles of consciousness, potentials within, that manifest secondarily. I mean, hence
mhm.
these, they're images on the ancient temples and in the mythologies and in our dreams, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they're there to compensate and correct in a meaningful way the otherwise limited as ego consciousness, which can be oppressive because it is so limited. I mean,
mhm,
so to repress that kind of worldview, it was going, like Jung said, it would, the gods manifest now in disease, right? And
mhm.
diseases, and I
The
feel
things that we don't understand and don't have power over, we've filled in the blank edges of the map so much that the only things that we feel like we can't explain with a test tube or particle physics or something are the things that are killing us that we can't stop. So that was the extent of our religion. Which I mean, I think you
yeah.
see that archetypal energy coming out with something like COVID, where some of the political reactions are almost like schizophrenia. We just this bursting of unconscious archetypes because people don't understand what's happening.
And because we historically have denied the shadow,
Hmm.
I mean, what to me, I remember when COVID broke out, like all of us do, but I remember that was on the heels of how many millions of animals that had died in the Australian bushfires.
Yeah.
To me, I wondered, I thought, I was chilled, I mean, horrified. And I thought, what kind of repercussion are we going to experience as a
Mhm.
result of that, And well, I mean, of course, I mean, because a plague, you know, why wouldn't we? We act as if we're not connected. That's where that limited, that's where our science has been so reductive.
Mhm.
And it's time for like a leap because we've learned so much from our sciences. Now we have to connect them. Now we have to, join the ancient with the new so that we don't really successfully destroy ourselves so that maybe humanity can make it through this collective rite of passage, as Richard Tarnas calls it. And there's, to me, there's really no other way to look at it. Any rite of passage, there is a death and a hope of a rebirth.
Mhm.
That rebirth isn't guaranteed. That's what makes it real, right?
And we
That's what
can't really have one foot in the next thing before we let go of the old thing. You kind of have to watch it go away, and maybe there isn't.
Well,
You,
yes and no, Joel, because one of the things that I think this is where imagination comes in. One of the things that the Buddhist scholar, now in her 90s, activist Joanna Macy says is that we cannot give birth to what we have not first imagined in our hearts,
Mhm.
cherished in our hearts. That's the word she
That's
used.
more of an intuition, than an intellectual ego-based knowledge.
It's more, yeah, and it has more to do with, yeah, feeling and imagination. Now, remember that
Mhm.
Einstein said imagination was more important than knowledge. The 14th century alchemist Martin Rulin said that imagination is the star in man, the celestial star in man. Paracelsus called it the sun in man. And French philosopher and Islamic scholar Henri Corbin said that the heart is the seat of the imagination, that and the heart speaks in images. And so for us to be able to imagine first what it is, that's, I think that's the biggest challenge of all in a disenchanted world. You know, it's not, as the Corbin talked about, the mundus imaginalis, right? The imaginal world, imaginal, not imaginary. So,
Mhm.
and he coined the term imaginal to distinguish between imaginal and imaginary, which we consider
Mhm.
more like fantasy. Imaginal,
Escapism.
yes, escapism, well put. So the imagination, to lead forth with the imagination that arises from the heart, that's different. And it's
Mhm.
and it's not easy. I mean, and it's
No,
best done in groups. It's
and
best done in groups.
it's harder. Well, and there's some sort of peer review of the soul that happens in a group. Because one of the things I tell patients a lot is that your trauma and your intuition come from the same part of the brain. Until you deal with the trauma, how do you know what it is that you're really feeling and acting on? It feels like this kind of unconscious compulsion. Does this guy have 4 stars on Google and everybody says he's a good guy, but something I'm just getting a feeling that this is not right. Or am I afraid of men in red sweaters? Like, you don't know. And so while there's so much pain, I think one of the problems with the imaginary is that we project kind of our shadow into it. Whereas when you're really in the experience of the imaginal, it's kind of beneath that.
It's kind of what?
It's kind of beneath that.
Oh,
It's
I see. Yeah.
deeper. It's and I think that's, you were talking about Hellman, but I think that's what Hellman was looking for. Part of his frustration with the institutes when he leaves is he was tired of analysis. He wanted direct experience. And I think
Yeah.
he wanted more direct experience than he thought that a monotheistic faith like, Judaism that he was coming from, or Christianity, could could have
But
that.
that's precisely was his point, was that we have a polytheistic psyche. That was one of the, that
Mhm.
his that was his thing. It wasn't
Mhm.
a reversion or a desire to return to that, to the Greek religion, but to recognition of a polytheistic psyche. You
Mhm.
know, Jung said, he said, when the earth was de-psychized, right?
Mhm.
So de-souled, in other words, that what we did, we imagined that somehow we were so sophisticated now. We were way beyond these ancient religions that imagined that a rock had life, or that it could speak, or anything
Mhm.
that, and yet, so what we did was project our demons and our shadows and our darknesses onto other people.
Yeah. Because they were the only thing left alive. There was no conversation with the world, and you have your conversation through the world interpersonally. That's dangerous. Um,
That's
whereas
it. When we consider the atrocities committed by the Inquisition
Mhm.
that expanded from Europe to the Americas, the worst torture devices in human history were created in the name of Christ. It's
Yeah.
phenomenal. Misogynist priesthood that were afraid of their own sexuality and women, and so they were able to project the evil outwards and create the most hideous torture devices and become purged in that process. I mean,
Mhm.
the level of perversion and brutality is mind-boggling, and yet that is what we've done to anything. And the ancient peoples, whenever the ensouled world spoke to them again, they were
Mhm.
so traumatized by the fear imposed upon them that they then would project it outwardly as shadow, as evil. Oh
Mhm.
no, we can't listen to that. Astrology became evil. Anything that was ensouled other than the Trinity and human beings, that was considered evil. I mean, that's incredibly reductionist. I mean, and it would be no wonder that Hillman or anybody would at a certain point go, yeah, this isn't working. The monotheism, that's not how the psyche is structured. We are polytheistically structured. So
We're
we
parts
can,
based. There's a lot of parts of us, and when you try and make it a monolith, it doesn't work as well. I mean, just interpersonally. I mean, I think one of the reasons why depth psychology is a little bit more effective than and doing cognitive or boundaries based counseling, starting there instead of with the emotional. You start with the intellectual. Is when you do when you understand the parts of yourself, you understand the parts of other people. So at Thanksgiving, I don't have to decide between denying who granddad really is and saying, well, he's the best guy ever, or canceling him and causing a big scene. I can kind of be like, this is the unrealized potential of this person who I love, and it's very sad. It's a tragedy they don't actualize that. Also, these are the parts of him that I like. And when people are less monolithic, just individually, we're a little bit easier to be around. And when society and religion is a little bit less monolithic, we are usually a little bit uh, you know, uh, we're gentler, and there are less, Iron Maidens that we're using to try and
yes,
purify the
and
faith.
maidens. Well put, and maybe even less wars. You
Yeah.
know, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's so much to consider. You
I think
know,
it's vulnerability. If you need like where Christianity in its worst phases, like you're talking about, is where it needs to be perfect. And if it needs to be perfect, then everything else is projected outside. And so, like, if I am if I'm raised to hate vulnerability, imperfection, and I have to disown my own and repress it, then I'm going to project it and attack it. So what happens there is anybody who you see who is hurting, well, that is good because I'm always going to side with the abuser in every case. And anytime anyone's hurting somebody, I'm on the side of the person who's doing the hurting, and the person who is getting hurt is bad. And then, whatever your theology or politics or mythology is, it's secondary to that. That's the emotional reaction is first, that archetypal reaction. And then second, you're like, oh, well, the free market did it, or, well, they aren't Christian. You invent a reason later, but the need when you feel like you are perfect, and you're repressing your vulnerability is to project that vulnerability and attack it externally.
that whole idea of perfection is it, isn't it? I mean, I think that's really key, and it's so different, let's say, than the aim of depth psychology or the Jungian depth psychology, because I mean, the where the aim isn't perfection but wholeness. We are light and dark. We are conscious and unconscious. The ancient gods of old were creative and destructive. That's just an image of wholeness. And
You don't really want to look in the Ark of the Covenant. It's too much for one person to hold.
well, archetypal, what happens when you view the god? I mean, there's an insanity, right? A madness
Mhm.
or death that ensues, right?
Mhm.
um I mean, so that whole notion again of perfection, I think, has really stilted the culture in such a sort of a brutal and one-sided way. I mean, I grew up Catholic, and dang, that kind of stuff
Mm.
stays with you, and I remember that striving for perfection, and I think, no, 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 we're human. We are light and dark. We are vulnerable and strong. You
Well,
know.
and where Catholicism seems to have gotten more entrenched and stabilized is where the people, usually in South America, people have more of a relationship with individual saints.
Well,
You
that's
have more
it.
of a container for the divine, whereas the places where it becomes the Spanish Inquisition tend to burn out. The saints are all able to hold an aspect of divinity.
And I feel that, I mean, innately, when you're having lived in Latin America for 15 years, the saints' days in Mexico are celebrated year round. I mean, you
Mhm.
can see that there's the polytheistic psyche,
Mhm.
and while they're very Catholic, well, it's still very Christian,
Yeah.
and there's still the great fear of the devil. It's so, when I lived in Michoacan, well, I mean, it's really throughout Mexico, it's particularly in the rural areas. These ancient biblical stories are enacted.
Mhm.
Where I lived right outside of a mask making village, and oh my God, I mean, it's like they would be incredible, Saint George fighting the dragons, or the devils fighting Michael the archangel. I mean, but in masks and
And
fabulous
as the psyche
costumes.
needs it, they create
Yes.
new saints that the Catholic Church may not even approve of, like Death is a
Mhm.
saint in a lot of regions of Mexico touched
Right.
by cartels and drug violence.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Yes,
I mean, they
indeed.
like, "Oh, the church left one out, we need to."
No,
Mhm.
so I wanted to go back to the idea of architecture.
Mhm.
In David Carrasco, who is a Mesoamerican scholar and academic professor in both the Harvard Divinity School and anthropology at Harvard. He's written a lot on Mesoamerica and the ancient religions, and he also edited Bernal Diaz del Castillo's History of New Spain. And Bernal Diaz del Castillo, for the readers who don't know, so he was one of in the 15th century, he was one of the chroniclers, Spanish chroniclers, as well as a soldier, right? So obviously everything is written for the king. They're trying to sell their, their wars and whatever they're doing. And what Carrasco went back and did is he looked at the map, the ancient map of Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec capital, right? And what he noted was that it was created it was divided. There was the center and the 4 cardinal points. That's how the entire city was based. Now, the Mayans also, their architecture, their pyramids, their city-states, like the Aztecs, were placed according to the cosmos, according to the stars, in alignment with, right? And the 4 cardinal points and the center was considered the sacred geometry that united the 13 celestial realms and the 9 underworld realms with the middle world, which was us, the earth, right? And that as a sacred geometry, it allowed humans to the gods to interpenetrate the earth and all living beings at all times, and it allowed the humans to become sort of immersed in a mythical time.
Yeah.
In which
I think that's what Maffei is talking about when he's talking about the energy of Teot in his book.
Oh,
that
okay.
you're always channeling this energy that's moving back and forth between worlds that looks very similar to like a metaphysics or to like a particle physics or something that we would have now. They
So
sort of understood identity and divinity as a particle and a wave.
I need to. What's the name of that book again?
It's called Aztec Philosophy, but Aztec metaphysics might have been a better name.
All right, great. So one of the things that Carrasco mentions is one of the Aztec wise men once commented that if Tenochtitlan were to fall, if the capital were to fall, the sky would collapse. Now, if we interchange the word sky with consciousness, we could say that it did collapse. The consciousness of humanity did collapse, and we fell into kind of a darkness the last 500 years where we imagined ourselves as orphans, floating around in the universe, right? Skin encapsulated egos, which of course served industrial revolution and the corporate fantasy, as Hellman called it. I mean, so it's served a purpose, and marched us, right to this point in history where we're brought to our knees, and yet it continues, convulsing and manically trying to get the last, vestiges of whatever needs to be
short-sighted by its nature. It can't be concerned with timeless things because that is obviously a longer term.
Because it goes against industrial growth. Progress, what we call progress. In other words,
go up.
So to me, that idea of creating, and I listened to that last podcast of yours, which I thought was fascinating. But if we're considering how to rebuild, how to reimagine the earth and recreate it, what does it look like? How do we realign ourselves with the stars in cities, in metropoli? I mean, to me, I used to have a program, one of my projects called Imagine, imagining a new world into being, because it's like peace. If you look up peace in any dictionary, you'll see that it's the absence of war. And if that's the case, then it's not likely we'll ever have it. Because if we can't imagine it, if we don't know what it looks like, what it feels like, then, well, again, it's not likely we'll ever have it. What does it look like? What is a city? What does a city that's aligned with the cosmos look like?
You can't even see the stars in a city. It's too bright. You've got to go out.
I live in LA. I mean, and there's for me, as someone that has a love affair with the stars, I feel that absence.
The Aztec solution, I think, was the calendar of festivals. I I mean, those festivals like are commemorating celestial events and dates. Um,
There it is. There's that alignment with the cosmos. That's the point. And that's, to me, is like, as we reimagine, we have to reconsider how cities are built. You know,
mhm.
that temenos space, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because where are our plazas? Even you go back to Greek structure, but they had the hearths, Hestia. There were hearths. You know, every place had their plazas with their central hearth, where
Hmm.
storytelling was happening. You know, where the
But
bar.
we still have the ripples of that. Like now, if you're having an interior designer come to your house and you drag your couch in front of your fireplace, something in us says that's not right. But we're not sitting there going like, "Oh, the Roman Penates, the hearth fires, the ancestors, and we must keep it burning at all times, or else it dishonor." Like that isn't something that we intellectually are doing anymore. Yet there is still this design language of do not put something in front of your fireplace because it has to be able to radiate out. Even if it's something that is not going to be affected by heat or something, you're designing around that as a central point. The caveman television or whatever, which goes back to the Greek Hestia or the Roman Penates, the ancestral altars that are burning all the time.
There you go. There you go. So, I mean, so that's it. That, how do we incorporate that wisdom into, let's say, interior design, exterior design, architecture?
Yeah,
How do we begin to, to create those kind of, um, well, again,
connections.
connections with the cosmos that we've been cut off from? You know, how do we re-enchant our earth? How do we
We
once
pulled
again
Psyche out of it and just into us, where the world is dead and we're alive. And I don't know if you've ever he's probably had a pretty net negative effect on the world, but one of the guys who does like basically kind of did the big last wave of American advertising. It's like a French clinical psychologist, but he figured out how to sell these products to Americans. And Sargento cheese was like really big in France, and so they played the ads here. And the cheese was like, it may be interesting to have him on the podcast if he'd return an email, but it was like hands touching it and warm light and people blowing the dust off the cheese and the bacterial, crust and all this. And they played it in America. Nobody wanted it. And they went to him and he was like, "No, in America, it's dead. You want a relationship with the cheese, that it's part of you and the community. They want it in a body bag." And he invented a zippable bag that all cheese has now. Sargento was the first company to do that. And it was his design because he said, in America, nothing is alive, everything is dead. You just want to be able to put the cheese in a body bag, was the line. And he
Wow.
also did the first ad for the first Hummer, where there's, it's a big scary car going through the town and it's, going over rocks in the city and it goes through the city and it looks real intimidating and the window rolls down and there's a teeny tiny blonde girl in it. And he said, the American man, he knows he's tiny and feminine and weak, but he needs a big car to protect, his. I mean, but like, you can't say what the guy said because you don't want that associated with the brand. But he wrote all these ads,
You know,
seeing those things.
that brings me back to one of the things that Jung said about the world of advertising and media. You know, he likened them to the dark magicians of the Renaissance.
It's a
You know,
myth, but it's not a good myth. It's
well,
it's
that's it.
magic.
It's magic that serves the corporate agenda and creates. It has spun the worldview that we are living.
It's
You know,
hijacking the religious impulse. You know.
there it is. There it
You
is.
don't have to be an artist. If you buy an Apple computer, you are an artist. You don't have to have a new way of life. If you walk into a Starbucks, you just get to,
That's well put. Hijacking. Say that again. Hijacking.
hijacking the religious impulse.
I
I mean,
love
one of the
it.
things I use with patients a lot is that, we all have this transcendent function. And if you think you're an enlightened atheist or the existential whatever, and I'm not saying you have to belong to organized religion or believe, in a metaphysical, supernatural anything. But if you're not aware where religion is operating in your life, then it's going to be operating unconsciously. And that's where you start to project the religious impulse onto products or onto what I can buy at Best Buy or onto like an economic system. It's like, say what you want about the free market or whatever, but it's not a religion, man. Like this, this is,
Well, but again, I mean, there it is. There we see that we see the dark wizards, right? The
yeah.
dark magicians of the Renaissance at work. You know, because they
Hmm.
know what they're doing. They understand it. They get it. I mean, the fact that this French advertiser was actually a psychologist, that's the whole point. You
Yeah.
know, and one of the things about the Jungian and archetypal depth psychology is what they did was they joined again psyche with logos, psychology.
Hmm.
You know, they created that. I mean, I mean, of course, let's say the pioneer Freud did too, but I mean, Jung just took it further, right? I mean,
Psyche and logic. I mean, that's a fight in psychology that goes back forever. That's still not solved. Cognitive therapists. Post '80s mainstream therapy wants it to be CBT. You're only what you do. Your only behavior. If you can't see it, taste it, touch it, count it, it's not real. And then there's kind of the more navel gazing, mystical, Jungian, emotion focused stuff of you are only what you feel. Who really cares about what's real? Quit your job, sell your shoes, become a Buddhist. And we need both of them. But we prefer one pretty strongly. And I think a lot of good therapy is about the integration of that, which I mean this is kind of going to the woods, but I think one of the only places where Jung is put better where by another writer, like he never is able to articulate what he's trying to say as well as another author puts him, as Edinger. And Edinger
oh,
says ego and archetype, the ego does not want to be in the same head as the subconscious mystical self. These two parts of self are at odds. I think that's underneath a lot of the tensions of the opposites that Jung talks about.
Well, I mean, and if we look at that as a spectrum, ego to the self with a capital S, meaning the God, the personal God image, right? I mean, it's something that we're always, that it's something that we're aiming towards, and yet,
it's not a destination; it's a process, and it's always hitting a moving target. So if you meet the therapist that says, "Oh, I've dealt with my shadow, I'm done," you don't know where that is in the room, man. I'll tell you where mine is. Like, it's not done. Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? These are.
That's why you got to be careful with the Freudians.
They're
they think it's over.
No, well, that's it, because in any given moment, every one of those gods, every one of those archetypes, every complex, every shadow has a life of its own. And yes, we can come to maybe they lose their autonomy to a degree. What did Hillman say? He said, we learn to carry a complex differently when we know that there's a God at the root of it. I mean, and that's the point. Is like, because we're never over it. It's an ongoing project. The healing process is an ongoing.
If you feel like you have dealt with an inevitability of psyche, then you don't understand how it works.
The inevitability of psyche. Yeah. Well, I mean, because psyche's, that's soul. You don't never. That's never done. But what psyche and logos, I mean, it's giving language to the soul, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so that's it. And understanding,
which is never done because it's so far beneath language. And by the time you've described it, you've cheapened it. I think that's why a lot of the Jungians leave in the 70s and 80s. All these people leave the institutes when they become so analytical and they're basically Jungian literalists. And you start to get, Arnie Mindell with process therapy and Sidra and Hal Stone with voice dialogue and, countless other people that left therapy to do workshops and, these different things because they wanted direct experience. And the institutes had become pure analysis forever that never ended. And so you saw that. And that's what Hillman, I think, was trying to articulate. I mean, that kind of drives Hillman mad until he finds the red book, at the end of his life. He's not a well guy. There's some clips. And it scares me because, like I see a lot of male Jungians having gone insane by the end of their life, and it's scary. I want to be careful. And I relate a lot to what Hillman did, but I also see where he kind of loses the thread. But I think that was what he was trying to articulate with archetypal psychology that he could never quite say, was that he wanted there to be this direct re-experiencing of these forces that he felt like no one else was paying attention to or even looking for anymore in therapy and psychology.
In therapy and psychology. And I think what to me, because to me, Hillman, because he did go back to, unlike Jung, who really worked hard because he was such a mystic, he worked so hard to be the empiricist scientist, right?
Until he couldn't be.
Well, and Hillman didn't have to do that so much. He went right into the romantics. And I love that about Hillman. To me, Hillman writes so much. What he writes is poetic, is poetry. Yeah, and he does become a cranky old man. And I loved what he did in we've had 100 years of psychoanalysis, right? And so to me, what he emphasized was that it has to be taken to the streets, which is what I think the podcast I mean, to me, that's what I aim for in my podcast, because what good is it if we're just, preaching to the choir? It does have to, it's like these concepts, that seek to re-enchant, reunite us with the ensouled world, with the anima mundi. This is key. This is key as we move forward in this, in this crucial Kairos moment, and go ahead.
Oh, no, please. Sorry. I didn't know.
Well, I mean, to me, that's it. I just feel like, to me, I draw from both, the Jungian and the archetypal, from the Mesoamerican, from mythology in general, from poetry, from art, from beauty, from music, from voice, all of these things, to where that are the language of the soul. It's a conscious, search for re-enchantment.
Well, and that oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
That's right. I mean, as a ritual artist, that's my work, is to sort of the re-enchantment. And
I'd like to hear a little bit about the ritual art. I mean, that's kind of the focus of our podcast, is like we want to talk about cutting edge of brain-based medicine, and how do you treat trauma with very modern approaches, but then also the depth psychology. Very few people have a foot in either world. Generally, half of our clinic or our ideology will piss off the guests. They like this thing that I posted, not that thing. Because we're talking about brain spotting and QEEG brain mapping over here, which I think are developing the neurology of the phenomenology that Jung described, and then the timeless, depth psychology things, which is why the podcast. I mean, you're talking about ritual art and all these different things. That's why we have a psychology of music, a psychology of screenwriting. We talk to rock stars, we talk to country musicians, we talk to architects, we talk to urban planners, because all of these are, how do you find the most, you're never going to get there, but how do you chase this vision of what is so deeply human in a way that is so ancient that we are disconnected from it, trying to find it. And when you really find it, it's more natural. It's more healthy.
Well put. And it is, to me, when I think about my process as a ritual artist, what the Jungian and the archetypal depth psychology allowed me was a framework to understand the work that I did. Because as a ritual artist, my work has always come from mythology and dreams, and the imagination, and giving them image. In ritual art itself, we know from the Romanian philosopher Mircea Eliade, as well as Marie-Louise von Franz, that whenever a space is consecrated, now, by consecration, it means like whether you're using copal or palo santo or sage, or what has been used.
You're taking it out of chaos and making it order. As Eliade Mircea would say.
And so you create what he called, what was actually called in ancient cultures was a sacred zone of absolute reality, right? And so, to me, that is just absolutely fascinating, that this space, by consecrating a zone, you've created the sacred zone of absolute reality that unites you with first of all, with mythic time of beginning, so that you can create anything from this space. And then you've invoked the four directions in the center, so now you're in sacred geometry that aligns you again, right, with the cosmic spheres and on the earth itself. And so from this space, that's where you could call ritual art active imagination. That's where every little piece, when you create your altar, you recognize as ensouled. Whether you're creating a mandala, and the mandala, Jung always encouraged his patients to make mandalas, because they bring resolution to the conflict, right? I mean, so whether you're making a mandala within a group, or you're creating ritual dance, you're enacting a myth, all of these things, the storytelling, everything is happening within a consecrated space. I mean, so that in and of itself becomes sort of like a re-enchantment, a metaphor, which is
a reenactment of the deep psyche, just like the Aztecs are doing, trying to reenact the forces that are under the world.
And that was part of the Aztecs. It was part of what they did. There was a process, world making, World Renewing. One of the in the World Renewing, they always reenacted the creation myths, and basically to give life to everything again, to renew everything again. And one of the things that Marie-Louise von Franz says in creation myths is that whenever creation myths are reenacted, recited, ritually recited, you know, they basically, like you said, they bring order to the chaos. And she cites a case of these Fiji shaman when the Fiji people were experiencing famine. And so the shaman go to the rice fields and circling the rice fields in ritual, they recite the rice creation myth, how rice came into being, as if, and this is her words, as if, it's like the rice is listening and is able to grow again, right?
They're reminding the world of how it works. And
Exactly.
reminding ourselves of how the world works.
And that's the role of myth. It comes to life, as Jung says, when we reenact it, when we recite it. And so that's something that I bring to ritual art. It's part of the storytelling, is whether it's with a dream that's being reacted, whether it's a myth, whether it's, we've consecrated the ground and we're entering this space of mythic time of the beginning, to bring resolution to the conflict, to reenact and reorder the psyche, right? So that we can find that outwardly, in our personal life, and likewise, this is extended to the community and
When I think that's the danger of an ego-driven, accomplishment, eternal growth-oriented culture, is that everything becomes hierarchical, that you're leveling up and getting more and more and more. And that isn't, one, sustainable, but two, it's not psychologically healthy. I mean, like when religion is working, when a spiritual principle is working, there is a descent and then a return. They're going back to the very beginning and saying, the egg came out of the water and then we all came from there's a reminding, whatever the creation myth is, the element is telling you where you came from, and reminding you, of a lot of things that are very human and very healthy to remember, that this is temporary, that it's not terribly important, that you're a part of a bigger thing, and all these things that we forget when it just becomes about how big can I get the number? How big can I get the empire?
The corporate fantasy, absolutely. And that whole point, I mean, that life, death, it was something that the Mesoamericans embraced, the concept of a life death cycle. Death is basically strategically denied in the corporate industrial growth fantasy, right? I mean, so death is part of it. Life and death it just goes together.
Can you say anything about the history of the Day of the Dead in modern Mexico? Because one of the facts that a lot of people like to play with is that it didn't exist until the James Bond movie, and then they decided that was a good tourism thing, and then they made the Day of the Dead. But that was sort of when it became, I guess, a national holiday and was promoted by the state. But a lot of those elements are incredibly timeless, and they go all the way back, way
Yeah.
before Live and Let Die.
I'll have to rewatch that movie because you're the second person that told me that. So when did that movie come out? Just curiously.
If I had to, I mean, I saw that movie in 7th grade, but the film stock and the color,
How old were you?
I would say like 64, probably. Let me Google it. Or maybe it was in the 80s even.
Okay. Because, so I moved to Mexico in 1990, and
I'm Googling it, so we will know.
All right,
for sure
cool.
when I'm listening to you. You can talk. I'm just letting
Okay,
you know there's noise.
so
Yeah.
when I moved to Mexico in 1990, I was living in Michoacan, like I said, which is my ancestry, and the Mexican Day of the Dead was an incredible and numinous experience there. I'll just give you a little brief background there. I lived in the Pátzcuaro area, which is Lake Pátzcuaro is about 50 square miles. It's enormous. It's fishing villages and artisan villages around the lake. And mythologically, the lake was considered the door to the underworld. And so it was alive with celestial beings, underworld beings. There was the rain god, Chupitiripeme, the Blue Lord. That was his residence. And it was the portal, like I say, to the underworlds where people went. And so that this many years later, that it was, it has become such a hub for the urban, Mexican urbanites and internationals. It's not a big surprise, but the Day of the Dead was an incredibly exuberant festival in Mesoamerica. And it lasted for like a month. And now it lasts about 2 weeks. So to say that, that James Bond gave it life. No. This was Mesoamerican, and it was one of the most celebrated and exuberant festivals in Mexico, well, in Mesoamerica ever. And it went morphing, because this is something I did study. It went morphing through the years. I mean, sometimes depending on who the monks were, they allowed it. They allowed it because they were receiving tithes from the people. They were receiving candles that were being made. They got rich from the fat and the food that was offered, because it was a big festival. It was a big festival for the dead, right? Because it coincided with the harvest. And they, so as a result, some of the monks were all for it. Yeah, this is great. And they had their altars inside their house as well as at their cemeteries, and they allowed it. And some of them were utterly opposed. So it depended on where you were in Mexico, at the time, in ancient Mesoamerica, but that it goes back, way beyond James Bond. Absolutely.
And it looks like it was just the parade. So I've heard that as kind of a fact that didn't sit well with me, that a lot of people have said that the movie invented Day of the Dead or something. And it looks like it was just the giant parade through Mexico City. That central one is the one. It's not the holiday, because the
okay. Okay. Well,
and it looks recent. I was thinking it was Live and Let Die, or that did it.
I know somebody else recently mentioned that to me. I'll have to watch that, because you have to watch it. But yeah, I mean, that it has, to me, that it's a cultural identity, and has, to me, it's true that it's grown. It's grown exponentially and everywhere. But that, to me, is also, that has to do with the archetypal nature of, to me, of death. It's, in a way, what I talk about it, the fact that it's crossed centuries and now borders, it in a way, it compensates for the industrial growth, corporate fantasy that denies death. And it brings it brings image to death that has heretofore been suppressed, right? It's been relegated to, whispers in hospital rooms, and the stuff of whether it's finances or, the logistics of the funeral, or, given over to the church to deal with any esoteric, or grief. And, but to me, the fact that death comes, and one of the things about the La Catrina, for instance, one of the main images, La Catrina means the fashionable lady. And so it's the fashionable lady death, right? We see this, her with her big fancy hat, turn of the century, swanky dresses and stuff. And it combines the Mesoamerican goddesses of death with the Spanish medieval idea that death comes mockingly to us all. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It made fun of the this was designed by Guadalupe Jose Posada, a lithographer and journalist who created that image, right, in the 1920s, and satirized politicians and everyday people, and made it as popular as it is in modernity, that face. Okay, because that face, it certainly didn't go back to Mesoamerica. That is modern, but that's the 1920s. And then Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and different muralists brought La Catrina to life. Claudio Lomnitz, who is a Mesoamerican scholar, he talks about the fact that he says that death is sort of like the national totem of Mexico, and a culture that was born, a nation that was born of a conquest, right? Because Mexico didn't exist until the 1500s. It was Mesoamerica, right? It was these ancient civilizations. And so that Mexico
had a lot of bejeweled skulls, it was further back than we have the history and the record of the mythology. They're doing a lot of things with skulls in this place.
So it is, and because there was so much, there was the revolution following, and everything was sort of tenuous. Death was always in the face, and it was a life-death cycle, and which, when death is present, whenever we have a close encounter with death, we become more fully into life. we're more conscious. Otherwise, we tend to sort of float around and imagine that we have time to whine,
And without death, then nothing is important. We feel immortality that is not real or is
Yeah,
illusory.
yeah.
Have you ever looked at the Santa Muerta cults, like the kind of
Not in depth, but I do know about them. Absolutely. I mean, it seems sort of relevant that the narcos and stuff would have resurrected that or
yeah.
or brought it to life. I'm not sure which. I don't know enough about it, but yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, and even the Aztecs weren't perfect. I mean, we definitely there's the myth of corporatism or infinite growth, and you're talking about, but the Aztec Empire was an empire. I mean, Aztec is even kind of a misnomer because it was the Mexica is the actual civilization. The Aztec was just
Mexica.
the military.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
that's so interesting. Absolutely. And it's the only thing we ever learn about really is the shadow, is that
Mhm.
it was the brutal,
Human
human
sacrifice
sacrifice.
and
And the human sacrifice, one of the things, and I'm so upset that I lost this because there was a British woman that his history podcast had on, and I don't remember the podcast. I don't even know how I came upon it. Spotify just put her there, and I was so mad because I was driving and I wanted to write it down. I should have pulled over because I don't have her name, but a British historian, and she talks about the fact that everything that she's researched says that that's just war. These were
Mhm.
prisoners of war. So to call it human sacrifice, is that what we're calling what's going on? What we committed, our empire is committed all over the planet. Are we
we
human?
should. Yeah, I mean, that's what
Well, that's it. How is it different? I mean, because we're doing it from the air. How are we more? Because it's more technological. Somehow that's less savage. I mean, war is war is war is war. It's just brutality. It's not. It's the opposite of civilized. I mean, yes, we can argue that point. Athena, a warrior goddess, springing from her father's head. I mean, she was also a goddess of civilization, wasn't she? I mean, she basically everything
wisdom.
she created, yeah, of wisdom, everything that she created was to you know was for a vessel for civilization, whether it was the yoke or the olive tree, the weaving, everything was a vessel for civilization to thrive. And the only time, unlike her brother Mars, the only time she went to war was to defend the polis, and
Mhm.
then she was brutal. Okay. So there's that, I mean, and she had the Gorgon on her shield to prove how incredibly brutal she was. So, to me, so now I'm going to go back to the Aztec, the empire, and everything does have its shadow, the idea. I mean, and they had, the Mexica, they had, he'd gotten way out of, power, corrupts, right? And when absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, it's what happens. So it was like, again, a revisioning as
Yeah.
when we glean the gold, what do we leave it, what can we leave behind? What do we learn from our history? And if we don't learn anything from our history, which seems like apparent, in modernity,
Mhm.
then we're destined to, commit the same atrocities and errors over and over and over. So what do we learn? I mean, empires. Let's think of another way of being.
They're not
Was it
terribly sustainable constructs. I mean, the flower wars, they would have that were basically like football, except you died. Yeah, I mean, you were doing it to protect a warrior class. You needed to have a war, but they had already conquered the area from. They had already expanded geographically as far as they could go. So an empire needs war. So what do? You have these flower wars where you go in and in order to advance in the ranks, you have to catch a certain amount of prisoners, and we need warriors, so we got to catch prisoners. And also, the empire's religion is based on sacrifice, so this gives us prisoners to sacrifice. But when a lot of the people that try and sugarcoat it a little bit more and say like, well, actually, the people, it was kind of an honor. The people liked getting sacrificed, like they were stoked for it. It was like, well, all of the surrounding policies sided immediately with Cortez. They weren't a fan of the empire part of it.
well, that's it. The thing is, when you think about the Mexica people and the role of Tlacaelel, who Miguel Leon Portilla in Aztec philosophy, Aztec thought and philosophy, which is I highly recommend. It's a beautiful book. He's a Mesoamerican scholar, obviously, and philologist. So he takes the Nahuatl word and he'll break it apart, and he does the close reading, and it's so in depth and it's so beautiful. But talking about Tlacaelel, when the Mexica people, when they were a warrior roaming tribes and without a home and looking for their home, they sold themselves off as mercenaries, right? And just sort of fought for whomever. And when they began finally establishing themselves, Tlacael, he was like the head military guy, and their king, the Mexican king, was saying, "Oh my God, I guess we're going to have to pay taxes to this guy." This is before they're an empire, right? But they finally established themselves. He's going to run us dry, but we're going to have to do it and everything. And Tlacael said, "No, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it." And what he did, he began an entire campaign, to basically in honor of the war god of Huitzilopochtli, and there you see the power of the archetype. I mean, the power of any religion. He basically, with his campaign, he said, we have to feed the war god, the blood that he needs to sustain us. There's that mystical military worldview that the Aztec or the Mexica people took on. And it basically made them the largest empire in that area. There's the power, again, like I say, of the religion, the archetype, because the war god was their main god. But at the same time, right alongside this mystico military worldview were the Tlametenime, the Aztec wise men, the astronomers, philosophers, the astrologers, the scientists, the mathematicians, that were the ones that created the social political order. Absolutely, the architects. And the whole point being there was that here they were poets, that spoke in metaphor, that sought truth through what they called flower and song, or which meant poetry, right? They spoke in these are called disfracismos, which means literally 2-word metaphors, but nouns. That means a noun is a person, place, or thing. It's not an adjective, and it's not a verb, right? So it's different. So and flower and song meant poetry. And so here these wise men were in love with, what Miguel Leon Portilla said, that they were enamored of the stars and poetry, and they were captives of beauty. I mean, it's what brought them to their knees. And basically the last 12, when they went above, to the Spanish, court, and basically said, well, if you say our gods are dead, then you might as well just kill us, because we can't go on with this, And I mean, in essence, it's what we have. It's sort of like a march. Miguel Leon Portilla compared that to let's say the German people, citizens at the time that Nazism was going on, right? And there were, incredibly, brilliant people right alongside Nazis. I mean, we have it in our culture,
Heidegger doesn't hang out, or he doesn't hold out very long against fascism.
So there it is, nationalism anywhere, it's like, that doesn't mean that there's another part of a culture. We like to say, oh, they were just brutal, barbaric, and buy into, that Hollywood Mel Gibson idea, it's like, Jesus, God, do your history, buddy. Do some work before you decide to create, your mouthpiece.
Yeah, that movie is particularly awful.
Oh
the
my
Mel
God,
Gibson movie is just beyond that. It's like ink and iconography in the middle of but like right outside the Aztec. I think my favorite scene in that movie is that like the guy like runs 300 feet or something, and then sees like he sees Tenochtitlan and is like, oh, what is this place? And you're like, what? Like, he didn't know that he was living right next to Mexico City. Like, because he was, I don't know. It's a really
I couldn't. I honestly, I have to be honest. I couldn't watch it because I knew, because Mel Gibson didn't do any research. It's like, what is this based on? His white supremacist ideas? What is this? I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying that he's a white supremacist, because I don't know his thing. But what I am saying is that that comes off, as white
I'm in trouble
supremacist.
for saying certain things before.
Okay, well, so I don't want to get in trouble, and I don't want to get you in trouble. But the truth of the matter is like, do your
Well,
research
he's
if you're
our
going
guest
to create
next
a
week,
film.
so hopefully, maybe we can.
Good one, I like it.
Yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is like, no, do your research, do your work. If you're going to make a movie about ancient history, don't just spread more crap. Don't spread more lies. Let's have some in-depth study, of ancient religions, ancient civilizations we can learn from. Not religions so much, but civilizations that we can learn from. Not just go, oh my God, hideous.
Well, Joseph Campbell writes Hero with a Thousand Faces. George Lucas reads it and then is like, this is how you should write movies, and then he turns Hero with a Thousand Faces into Star Wars, which is, one of the highest grossing, entities in the history of Hollywood. And then for the
I know.
next,
I raised
40
my
years, they've
Star
been
Wars.
like,
I love
wait, how
Star
do we
Wars.
do that? How
The
do we
original Star
how do
Wars.
we do that? And it's like, if you
Yeah.
understand religion, if you understand mythology, you can make movies because that's what you're doing, whether or not you understand it.
Well, J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, it's the same kind of thing. Or to me, I appreciate, or Lord of the Rings. To me, I appreciate a good mythology that's on screen. They pull it off. That's good. I'm happy with that. I can spend hours watching marathoning those. The original Star Wars, not. I mean, there are some exceptions that have followed. Which are more sort of dystopian, Andor I absolutely love, but it is totally dystopian. But it is it's a good reflection of where we are at this point.
I don't think Disney can say this, or the screenwriter's smart. They probably won't. But Andor looks a whole lot like the writings of Che Guevara. Like there's scenes that are directly
Oh, is
lifted.
that right?
I mean, that's what I see, but I could be
That's
totally
interesting.
wrong, and I'm sure if that's true, it'll never be said.
Okay, well, I don't know that. I haven't read Che Guevara's writings. I'll confer with my sister on that because she has.
Motorcycle Diaries is beautiful. That's a
I do.
really
It
nice
is
one.
beautiful.
Yeah.
That is a beauty. I love that one. I showed that one to my students. Yeah, that's a good one. Anyway, then my whole point is I go to Mesoamerica to glean the wisdom that I can, to put the archetypal lens on, and say, this is what we need, now. How do we imagine this world into being now? How can we glean ancient and, blend it with the wisdom that we have learned in the modern and
You familiar, like, what is it? There's David Tacey calls it the post-secular sacred, but there's a lot of you can kind of see Jung touch on it a little bit, but the idea that there's kind of phases of human consciousness. The first one is very mythic and magical thinking, that we just look at the world and we project our psychology on it, and then we don't recognize the projection and we think it's real, and we say, okay, here's this God, and the sun is about me, and the moon is about me, and whatever. And then that age wanes, and there's a scientific revolution of we can just explain everything and distill it down to a test tube. And then we've killed all of that. None of that is real anymore. We can understand everything intellectually, but that sort of fails too. And Jung alluded to this third phase, that there's a place that you go into that's, okay, we need science. Science is sort of helpful. I want to cure my scrofula or whatever. But also, it can't explain everything. Like part of Jung spends a lot of time, talking to Pauli about that at Bollingen. That there's this, that science is going to bump up against the inevitability of religion anyway. You're going to get to this place where your intellectual ability to understand the world doesn't save you. And there you have to, the answer is not, as some people accuse Hillman of saying, going back to ancient religion and digging that up, and throwing science aside. It is to recognize the limitation of science and to trust the intuition of a connection to place and a connection to these archetypal realities, even if we don't understand it intellectually, like even if we can't. And I think that's where we are right now, is we're very bad at doing things that we can't understand, that we can explain.
I agree. And I think that's where synchronicity comes in. I think that there needs to be a lot more studies done in synchronicity, because synchronicity allows us, and Jung defines synchronicity as the, meaningful coincidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that being evidence, like say, that we have of ensouled, conscious, intelligent, communicative universe speaking with us that we're a part of, right? I mean, for us to sort of awaken to that reality, and to become conscious participants in the ensouled worldview. And synchronicity, I think, is that sort of that third factor that can allow that and go, I've lived too many synchronicities to go, to disregard them. Oh, it's just a coincidence. No, no. There are coincidences, but meaningful coincidences, that's different. Meaningful coincidences that just go, whoa, and there's always the story of the golden scarab dream that Jung shares with his client, and who's been a skeptic and more in line with the reductive science, and is not sort of buying into Jung's enchanted worldview. And when she tells the dream of the golden scarab, they're knock, tap, 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 and insistent at Jung's window. And finally he opens the window, grabs what is the equivalent of the golden scarab in his hands and says, "Here's your golden scarab." So that kind of synchronicity that occurs all the time, and I think it really does act as this third place that we need more and more research being done on, so that we can.
How do you research that, though? How do you turn that kind of intuition into a number? Because what you're talking about is looking at things that we can't understand,
collecting data,
and letting them still make meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if science wants it, to do it, they can collect data on that. What's the synchronicity? Collecting data, how many people, on a certain number of people through their life. You know what I mean? I don't find, to me, I'm far too Jungian to need that kind, but I do think that synchronicity can provide that for the science and the more depth psychological to find a union. I do think that that's where that
maybe the connection though is more in our intuition, that like you're saying, that COVID is happening over here and then Australia is on fire over there, like somebody who comes from a very logical existential place is going to be like, what is the connection? How can you possibly say that we burned Australia down and that made a virus in China that spread here? But when you sit with it as more of like a human intuitive thing that doesn't need a logical or rational connection, it's like further we move on this project, the worse it feels. I don't like seeing videos of the dead things on fire as we do this to the planet. I don't like living in a world where community has been so rendered that we can't even come together to make a plan for a plague, or that you can feel that these things are moving in a direction that isn't good, and kind of go back to the drawing board and say, how do we do this better, instead of how do we keep managing something that doesn't work. And I personally, I don't know that science ever gets you there. I mean, I think that is more of a felt connection to things than one that you can, turn into a number. And then
a number. Well, I would agree, 100%. But if science wants it, that those are the areas that I say go there, look for, find the research there. If you want those numbers, go there. Because it is, it only has been sort of reductive to imagine that we're disconnected. To imagine that if over 25 million animals die in the brush fire of Australia, is not going to have some kind of effect on us. It's like that study that they did on the wolves, and I think it was Yellowstone, right? When they got rid of the wolves, how their ecosystem just went to hell in a basket, and by reintroducing them, everything came back to life. I mean, come on, it's we have to learn from nature, biomimicry.
There's a study that they've been trying to like disprove for a really long time. They keep controlling for it, but they're like, I think it was in the 90s. There's a study that said basically if there's trees around, crime will go down. And so everybody kept being like, oh, we have to come up with the intellectual reasons. They've done like 5 different other studies where they tried to control for things, like where they're like, well, maybe there's trees in wealthier neighborhoods and there's less crime around wealthier neighborhoods. And then you go back and look at it and turns out there's no correlation there when you control for income. It's still, and then they said, well, maybe the trees drop leaves. And then when you drop the leaves, people can't walk on them to sneak up to the house because they crunch. And then they do control for that variable. And turns out that when you do it in another season or you do it with evergreens, the trees just make people commit less crime. And but there's this scientific existential impulse to say, yeah, but why? We have to understand why it is. There's not this ability to just say maybe there's a connection to nature is slightly healthier And if you don't cut down all of the trees, things work better, even if you never figure out exactly why that is.
And when you think about it, to me, that we go back to the idea of creating the city. How is it that everybody can have trees and clean water and have access to swimming in rivers or going to the ocean? I live in LA, and there are children, in South Central that have never seen the beach at Santa Monica. That's the point, is like, I don't know if you're familiar with Caroline Casey, from the Visionary Activist Show.
I'm not.
Oh, you want to tune into her. She's
Okay.
an astrologer. Oh my God, yeah. She's astrologer, activist, and just a hoot. Deep and the mythic news. I mean, you do want to tune into her. You can hear her show. I mean, you just tune in, but she's on KPFA from the Bay Area. And oh God, now how did I get there? Oh no.
You're
I
talking about
lost my
kids
train.
not being able to see the ocean that live
Oh,
in the city and they're so close to it, I think.
so I mean, the whole point being is that, oh yeah, it's just, why is there more addiction among the poor? It's like, well, make reality better. That's what she says. Make reality
Yeah.
better. It's like, because it's not. It's not. How is it possible that kids from South Central have never seen Santa Monica? And why? And there used to be the cable cars that went there, that there was a whole trolley that went back and forth, on all the beaches that everybody could get to. We lost that. I mean, and then to corporate greed, honestly, there's no other way to put it. There was a system. And that's another thing when I think about reimagining, there are high-speed railways all over the world, except in the US. We have these antiquated, and I think about the effects on this antiquated railway system that we have, and why.
Millions of people don't travel, and if they do travel, it's expensive and they're alone. You're in the car.
Exactly, and it helps to keep the people separate.
Mhm.
If we want to hop on a train and go see the states in the Midwest, or if we want to go to the South, if we want to visit, if we can hop on a high-speed railway, we're going to do it. It'll be less expensive than a plane, ideally, than a plane. Less, if we can get them to be, green, a green high-speed railway, then, there'll be less environmental damage. And we can find that we actually have more in common with the people that we've been told, vote red or vote, blue. Maybe we're more purple, or, it's like we have to look. And I think to me, that is something that I don't understand, is what is it? I heard some, famous radio podcast guy that I stopped listening to saying, America's the greatest nation on earth. And I thought, in terms of what? In terms of what? I mean, in terms of propaganda?
In terms of me, I mean, viewing your children as an extension of your own ego is not good. Viewing your country as an extension of your own ego is not good.
No,
And
no.
really, viewing your anything as an extension of yourself is not great.
So
when
to me,
you
I find it. I found it really upsetting. But I think, when are we going to get our green high-speed railways? Why don't we have those?
or you've got what is it? Polyvinyl chloride train car derailing and turning the sky black, and Flint, Michigan without water, and
what
we're
happens?
bombing a country because we said that they were doing chemical warfare, and it's like, hey, this looks pretty nefarious and pretty chemical right there.
There you go.
We
And
have
yet, no.
drinking
And
water,
who's
please.
being held accountable for that? And what is going to happen to those people and the water and the people and the beings that live in the water and the water that those people drink? Nobody's accountable in the corporate industrial growth fantasy. Nobody's accountable. It's like, oh no. We just put the blinder on because it's all about profit for a certain elite. It's
Well,
not a.
all of the giant projects that you can talk about are about an external reality. It's building a wall or bombing a thing, or you need to bomb this one or not that one, or this one's good but that one's bad. But you can't repair the drinking water in a town that hasn't had drinking water for 10 years, which would be an infinitely cheaper project to do
There you go.
in a month.
In a month.
We can't talk about anything that's domestic. We can't build a school. We can't build a train. We can't even talk about it. You've got infrastructure that's falling apart. You got the slowest internet in the world, and I don't watch the news, but whenever I'm out and it's on, they're talking about something outside of my country, which I don't really want to participate in. I'd like to fix this one.
There you go. So, I mean, so to me, that kind of a vision, I think it's time. It's like, podcasts like yours that are, looking to find what what does a new world look like? One that from images that we cherish in our hearts. How do we, you know,
Well, you won't be attacked more than if you just say, "Could we just imagine a little bit better of a world?" You don't need, like, that's not even an argument. It's not even a, it's like people are immediately like, "That's not reasonable. That's not that's not moderate. What do you who do you think you are?" And I'm like, man, like, it's either that, it's that you're stupid and naive and unreasonable if you just say
there you
like, maybe
go.
things could be slightly better and this doesn't work great. That will get people more mad at you. Or there's splitting. It's like, well, you must be a Democratic pedophile or you must be a Republican fascist. And you're like, I just said, can we maybe have a, I wrote that article about architecture saying, that I liked that Frank Lloyd Wright, tried to meditate on the land and then the use of the space that the people were going to have, and then a higher spiritual principle for that thing, and kind of rested those together. And that's why his buildings functions sort of like altars, which doesn't always work. I mean, but that was his process. I like his process there. And my point was like, not Frank Lloyd Wright built buildings like altars, that it's like architecture is an altar. But right now it's an altar to very dark gods. It's
Well put.
billboards and Hobby Lobby wraps with cheap sentiment. And, I got all this pushback on there where I was like, I went into a school where there were things like windows. Um, and now we don't do that, but we have a TV every 2 feet on the wall to show something when you could just have a window. Just there was, a garden at the school that I went to, and we got all these emails where people are like, well, in the 60s and 70s, they built schools this way and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, look, if we ever chose to send kids into a place that looked like a federal prison, that was made out of cinder blocks and painted with vinyl paint and had a giant fence around it with razor wire, if we ever thought that was an okay thing to do, then we need to apologize for that until we have taken every single one of those things apart and built a school. Okay? Like, I don't care that in 1970 they thought it was distracting to see sunshine or whatever. I can't speak to that psychosis. What I can say is that that's a problem. And why are you sending me an email being like, yeah, but I mean, people did that a lot and it would be expensive. Yeah, all I'm saying is like, this is insane. You're telling me to take my child to a thing that looks like where we send felons when they're in
No,
kindergarten,
I
and
remember
someone is
being,
defending that to me.
yeah.
Why?
Yeah, no, I was so struck by that, your statement, because there is a school, there's a charter school about 2 miles from where I live that looks just like that prison. I think, good God, really, this is where they're sending kids to school. This is it. And this is like there's no evidence that if any green grass around it, there's no evidence. And the windows, are completely black. I don't know what's on the inside and what they can see from the outside, but it's absolutely soul killer, and that's where they're sending kids to school. And it breaks my heart. It's like, really? This is where they're sending kids to school. This is an educational facility. It's a lack of vision.
Well, we talked
Let's,
to Leon Creer, who was one of the founders of New Urbanism, and he would send me videos of when his town was like really tiny, and they're like black and white, and somebody's feeding a horse a sugar cube, and it's horse and buggy. It's like he's very old, and he's kind of out there, but he was talking about he was just building these classical buildings, and then they got into this modernist period, and people started saying, well, you can't. He got out of architecture, or he just quit doing it because he couldn't do it. The lady he was talking about building a school in Britain, and the lady came and said, look, I don't think you understand how schools work. There's windows here, and also there's a veranda outside where the students can go out in the open air. And he was like, yeah. And she said, if you do that, then there will be sexual perverts that walk by and look at the children. And this idea that when you see that modernism and Reagan and Thatcher are coming in, and there's all this paranoia, and that we're projecting all this stuff, and he's like he didn't even know what to say, and I was talking to him, he told me about he met Hillman, which
oh, wow.
he was like, oh, you sound like this guy that I met a long time ago. That's right, Hillman. I was like, oh no. But he said that Hillman told him, when you go to European architecture, the lines go up, and so you're always called to look up at the heavens. When you go to American architecture, we put a drop ceiling with fluorescent lights so that when you go into work, you have to stare down into hell. Which I thought was really funny.
No, fair enough. Hillman talked about the anemic buildings. He really, to me, his thing on architecture was just right to the point. Because it makes such a difference. Prisons, just the whole notion of prisons to begin with. But in prisons, the ceiling is so low. What that does is that's oppressive. That's so incredibly oppressive to the soul. When we walk into a church, the first thing that we notice is the ceilings, isn't it? Especially if you're in a city. The first thing when you walk into any, fabulous old cathedral, it's like, what does it do? It opens us right up. The soul just sort of opens, the spirit opens. It's like it creates a refuge, doesn't it? As opposed to these, drop ceilings with the fluorescent lights that just, they make us look right into hell. They're an underworld experience. And that's what, how, it seems like prisons are designed just to, just the whole notion of prisons to me is like, that all has to be reimagined. But so much, I think, goes back to that idea, of Carolyn Casey's make reality better. And that might be simple, naive, whatever, but it's not.
Well, why does that statement make people as angry as it does?
And it does. Because it sounds simple and naive, when in fact it means we actually have to use our minds, our imaginations, our hearts, our intuition, to figure it out. Let's take the time, instead of bombing people everywhere and oppressing, people in our, for a profit. Let's reconsider. Let's reimagine. Let's think about what a new world looks like. How does if we consider that this incredibly beautiful planet that we're born on, and we've really systematically tried, ravaged and, burned to hell and cut down and done hideous things too. But if we can reimagine this paradise, how do we, create something where we can live with one another, and hold a tension of opposites? Maybe we don't always agree with what someone's saying, but we don't have to take up arms. We don't need to be carrying AK-47s, into,
to do that, we have to admit that we don't know. And we have to just sit for a minute in the fact that we agree on that's where we want to be. We don't agree on how to get there.
There you go. And that's a vulnerability that we don't have. We're not allowed. It's not a, it's not a way, to be, to take that pause and go, oh, okay, we don't know.
It comes down, do you want to be perfect or do you want to be whole?
Yeah.
We're not very good at admitting that we're not perfect.
There you go. Yeah, let's drop that one. Let's drop the whole perfect notion. Let's start with that one. I think that's a good way to begin.
Yeah. Well, that probably is a good place to end too, unless there's anything else that you feel like you'd like to get to or didn't. And we can have a conversation on another topic again.
Lovely.
On your podcast, your mind too. So.
Yes, please. I'd love to have you on my podcast. This has been lovely, and you can tell us more about what you do.
Yeah. That would make room. The conversation would probably make room more to talk about Taproot and some of the stuff.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'd like to do that.
Not a lot of places like it yet.
Yeah, I know more about it. So I'm definitely, scheduling you so that you can tell me about the Taproot and what you're doing.
Well, so if you want to check out the Blue Medicine Journal, that would be the podcast to look up. I know that you can find it on Podbean, but Google will probably get you there. I think you're in Podbean and Google podcast right now.
Right.
Apple's the big one you want to get.
That's the one that I've been trying to connect with and will successfully at some point.
All right. Well, check out the Blue Medicine Journal, and then hopefully I'll be on there, and maybe we will hear from Sandra again. So I'm.
Fair deal with an American seal and corporate handshake.